Hi, everyone. This episode is going to be number 26 in our series on the virgin birth, and it's going to be a uh, discussion about an article I read from Robertson, a very famous commentator from an article he wrote in 1926. And I'm very concerned about this kind of view that Robertson took in this article. And I want to use this as an exposition, if you will, about the significance of actually misteaching and making the mistake, the more than a mistake, of teaching people that you can just disregard the genealogies in the account of Matthew and Luke are both obviously intended to have ended with Joseph begat Jesus, and somebody changed them. There's no reason to even put them in there if there's a virgin birth account. You just simply do an account that miraculously Mary was told you're going to have a virgin birth, and here's your virgin birth. Because if that's all you've got is a genealogy of Jesus, then you don't need the genealogy of Jesus, unless you're trying to prove that Joseph fulfilled a certain prophecy in the book of Samuel, which a Jewish person knows why it's there. But the Christian people were generally ignorant Gentiles, and we don't know why anybody would put it in there. And Robertson does a whole article where he never tells us, the stupid Gentiles, why it would be in there. Yet he tells you it's the major obstacle to believing the virgin birth account is true, but he never tells you why. To me, that means he's misleading. That means he's committing a fraud on the Gentiles who don't know any better. And he deliberately didn't tell you and I that 2 Samuel is what is the purpose of those genealogies, to prove that Jesus had a Davidic heir in the person of Joseph. Someone, therefore, had deliberately removed, it said Joseph begat Jesus, and leaving it so you have a butcher of two disparate and contradictory views. One is Jesus as a lineage from Joseph, and there is no such thing as adoption, becoming of the line of someone by adoption. You had to be born of that person to be in that house. So to be considered of that flesh, and that was the prophecy, was he would be of the Messiah in 2 Samuel has to be of the flesh of David, and David's heirs line was what was being recorded in both Matthew 1 and in Luke, as we'll see. Anyway, so the question I pose to you, I've said clearly that just believing in the virgin birth doesn't send you to hell if it were untrue, and doesn't make you more virtuous that you don't. If you believe Jesus is truly the Davidic heir, that doesn't make you more virtuous either. You're not going to heaven because you believe that fact, okay? But what would be sending you to hell, in my view, is if you mislead people that it doesn't matter whether Jesus was born of a virgin, or it doesn't matter if he was born of the Davidic line, because that means that if they know the person you're talking to and you're trying to lead them to Christ, and they are trying to make a decision to accept Jesus, and they find out that 2 Samuel says he has to be of the Davidic line of the flesh of David, as is recorded even by Peter. We're going to show you Peter says Jesus was born of the flesh of David, and so does Paul say he was born of the flesh of David. Why would they have said that unless they thought it was important? Why are the genealogies there unless they were important? So my point is this: if somebody like Robertson gives the false impression to a person who's on the fence, who doesn't know whether to accept Jesus as the Messiah or not, and they realize and they do research, and it says in 2 Samuel he has to have the flesh of David, and you've led them to believe it doesn't matter whether he's a virgin birth or not, and you endorse the virgin birth, then you have misled somebody to potentially not make a decision for Christ. Because why would you believe in Jesus being the Christ if he can't be the Messiah? You cannot be the Messiah unless you have a Davidic line. That is a fact. And I'm going to quote that passage so you can absolutely take it to the bank. So here's the topic of today's episode. Will God pardon Robertson for this article for deflecting that Joseph was the father of Jesus? He does everything he can to deflect it. That, in fact, the verse originally said Joseph begat Jesus, even though there's evidence all in front of him, all around him. He just does everything to ignore it and never tell you what was at stake. That Jesus cannot be Messiah unless he's of the flesh of David. If he had told you that, you might have weighed things differently and said, you know what? Even though there's only maybe one verse that we absolutely know came earlier in time, the earliest says Joseph begat Jesus, and maybe it's only one, but it's the only one that saves Jesus being the Messiah. I think a Christian would say, I think I need to put my weight on that verse and see how many other verses can come along and support that. Because that's what he's going to tell you. There's only, in his view, there's only one verse, and he actually says, in truth, if the one verse is supports is supported, you could support the entire doctrine of the Davidic lineage of Jesus from that verse. But then he doesn't tell you how important that is, and then he virtually says we should make this decision and recommend that is the truth, that Jesus had been born of Joseph, and we have to consider the Orthodox view is that Jesus had a virgin birth, and so it becomes this whole thing about the opinion of man, and that we make decisions based on appearances of how many people agree on something. That is not how we determine canon. We determine canon by the Word of God. And the Word of God has to be consistent and true. And what Robertson is saying is you can have something totally inconsistent with God's Word and still be God's Word, which it cannot be by definition. So that's my first question. Will God pardon Robertson for his deflecting Joseph was the father of Jesus? With that background. And then what about Robertson's claim it's better to deny this, that Joseph is the father of Jesus, than accept Joseph was Jesus' father? That it's just better, just simply better to do that, to not even regard it as a significant fact. Just it's better, just accept it's not Joseph. It's a virgin birth. He doesn't tell you what's at risk. If you repeat that to someone else and that person gets a false impression that Jesus doesn't have to have Joseph as his father, that's the problem. And that's where we are today, is because we're dumb Gentiles. We do not know what is at stake. We do not know what is at stake. And we do not know, they never tell us the early history of the church, the Ebion. The original church was called the Ebion, and even Jerome says so in his commentary on Galatians. And that Ebion had ruled that it said that Jesus was born of Joseph, and they were up in arms that somebody had corrupted and did a translation in Greek of the Hebrew Matthew, and they corrupted the text, and they said that Isaiah supposedly said a young virgin would have a child, and they said no, it doesn't mean that, and they hired Symmachus, the top expert in Hebrew in that time, in that era, to refute that whole position. And Symmachus came out and stood for the position of the Ebionites and said, nope, it means young woman, not young virgin. And that was all they needed him to say, is that somebody corrupted the scripture translation. And that was how they were trying to refute it. So this is the earliest church trying to put this to bed, thinking they they had done so. And yet it didn't go away, and it came back, and you have people like Robertson who seek to deflect it and don't think it's important. Now I'm going to show you why it is important. So that's just a topic. It's just it's a thing. But I'm also going to show you God tells us how he's going to judge us on Judgment Day. And I'm going to show you how he's going to judge Robertson. He gives you all the standards that you're going to read, and how he's going to assess what Robertson did. That's all. I'm going to show you what his principles are. First, let's start with Acts chapter 2, verse 30. This is Peter speaking, and he talks about the prophecy of Jesus' birth required that he had to have the true lineage of David. Peter, the apostle, Acts 3. Therefore, being a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him that the fruit of his loins, according to the flesh, he would raise up Christ to sit on his throne. What is he talking about? Have you ever heard this? This is the promise of Yahweh to David. That's what? Someone of the fruit of your loins according to the flesh, not some supernatural birth. No, from the flesh of your child. One of your ancestors will have a child, and that child will be the Messiah. That's what this is all about. Well, what was that a reference to? What is Peter quoting? He's quoting from this passage. It's 2 Samuel 7, verses 8 to 16. This is the NIV 2010, and let's read it. The Lord, that means in all caps, it means it's the word Yahweh. So I'm going to replace that when that is brought up. Yahweh declares to you that Yahweh himself will establish a house for you, to David. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood. Who quoted that? Peter. And I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom for a week, for a month, for a few years. No, forever. 14. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, and this, by the way, they don't like this. This is why they never quote you the passage, because it's very obvious God is saying he's a human being. And that's exactly why I picked him, because he's going to be a good boy. I'm going to train him up to be a good boy. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with flogging inflicted by human hands. Now, you go, oh my gosh. Many Christians don't know this, is that there for in Judaism, it's mentioned even in Isaiah, where it's talking about this child who's going to be born, and it says he'll reach an age of consciousness or conscientiousness, if you will, and until that point, the child is viewed, your child until age 13 is deemed to be sinless, no matter how bad you think they are. His God never judges them while they're still a child. But once they pass that point, now they're adults and they're judged by standards of ethics. So the fact that your child still does wrong, you still need to discipline them when they're below 13, but they're not judged by God in a sense of condemnation going to hell. Thank God, right? When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with flogging inflicted by human hands. So they don't like that, because that doesn't fit the virgin birth right there, does it? But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. Now you say to me, Doug, that can't apply to Jesus. Now I wanted you to see Peter quoting it first. Oh, Peter doesn't have any problem applying to Jesus. Do you think Peter actually might have read this passage? Of course he did, because he's quoting it. He's quoting it verbatim. The fruit of his loins, according to the flesh, is right there in the sentence, your own flesh and blood. All right? So, and he would sit on your throne. It's the same passage he's quoting. So there's no doubt the Ebion, the original church, the apostles, the 12, thought Jesus fulfilled this message. Therefore, this Jesus is going to be a king of the whole earth, but he did go through the life of a normal child where he had to be scolded. And God is saying, I will make sure he will be disciplined when he sinned, when he does wrong. I should be careful to say that. So we always say Jesus is sinless. Yes, he is sinless, because he reached maturity and was raised properly. And when he reached maturity, he didn't sin, and he was a righteous man. Okay, he had to be righteous, 100% righteous. But that doesn't mean he grew up and didn't do anything wrong as a child, like he had some magical deity from birth. No, that's not how it's told in the original version of the New Testament. It said at his baptism, this day I've begotten thee. It was there twice. In both Matthew and in Luke, it was removed in 405 AD by Jerome. But Jerome forgot to remove it from Hebrews 1 verse 5 and Hebrews 5 verse 5, where in Hebrews 5 verse 5 in particular, it says, who other than Jesus, the Lord, Jesus, did God ever speak from heaven, this day I've begotten thee, which is a clear reference back to the way it originally read and always read in both Matthew and in Luke for centuries. So this is crucial, and yet Robertson never mentions it. It's embarrassing, because what is embarrassing about it? Because it doesn't fit the Trinity. And so the real thing that's going on here is the Trinity doctrine is undergirding why nobody wants to fix this. Nobody wants to tell you what the passage is that makes Jesus Messiah. It's this passage. If this passage isn't true about Jesus, then he can't be Messiah. This is the whole promise, going to an heir to be a Messiah. Now you say, well, where's the word Messiah? Well, you can't see it because you don't understand the law, and you don't understand how kings are anointed at their king when they're installed as kings. So this says the person will be a king, right? Well, what happens when a king becomes a king in Israel? They have to be anointed. What's the word for that in Greek? Christos. They have to be Christos. they have to be they have to be subject to an anointing. They have to be subject to Christos, and that's the Greek word for anointing in Hebrew. So this is why Jesus is said to be the Christ, because of this passage, my friends. You are never told this, and we're left as dumb Gentiles, and we don't even have a clue that the virgin birth destroys this passage applying and makes Peter look like a fool and makes all of us following a false person. Do you not get this? And because they don't want you to know this, and they're embarrassed by it because they believe in the Trinity, they will not tell you the truth. And Robertson is exactly like that. He will not tell you the truth, and he'll mislead you and tell you he's not going to go along with even there's one passage that finally they found it in the Syriac Sinaiticus. This woman, Agnes Lewis, found it, and he's willing to refute it and not even refute it, just simply say it's not enough. It's not enough for him. But he doesn't tell you what's at stake. If it's not enough, then Jesus isn't the Christ. And he doesn't tell you that. He lets you think it's just something you have an option not to agree with. But the truth is, you don't have an option to believe in it. None of us have an option to believe that Jesus isn't the Christ. If you want to be a Christian, you have to believe Jesus is Christ. And when the evidence is shown, finally, after all these centuries, the manuscripts have emerged that prove that it said originally Joseph begat Jesus. We now have to say, hey, fantastic. God has rescued us from this dark pit and showed us the evidence proved all along for centuries in the dust, in these manuscripts, that Jesus was indeed the Messiah. Boom. But he doesn't want you to know that. And that's, to me, what is so despicable about what Robertson did. So I'm going to tell you and read you now how God judges these things. In Isaiah 59, Yahweh God reviews that false accusations are made in court and lying is rampant. Then Yahweh God declares in Isaiah 59, verses 15 to 19, his lament that no one will intercede to defend the innocent. And so God himself rose up to do so. And I want to tell you, who are the innocent here? It's the Ebionite, because then you have to realize he's going to mention the Ebionite multiple times in this article, and he calls them heretics and says, we have to get away from the Ebionite doctrine that Jesus was a man and Jesus wasn't, God and all this kind of stuff. Because why? Because they're making the Trinity, something that isn't even spoken of in Scripture, more important than Jesus even being the Messiah. That is so backwards. If Jesus isn't the Messiah, it wouldn't even matter if you were God, if you want to think about it. Then we're calling someone, we should just simply say we believe Jesus is God and we don't believe he's Messiah, because you can't have it both ways. He has to be a human being to be the Messiah. He has to be born a human being of a person who's in the Davidic line. But listen to this. These are the judgment words of God. Truth is lacking. He who departs from evil makes himself a prey. Now, what does that mean? If you and I step out of bounds and we say, hey, we're not going along with this heresy that Jesus didn't have Joseph as his father, and whoever changed the text is the corrupter. Instead, Robertson is more leaning towards whoever changed it from the virgin birth to have these variants that say Joseph begat Jesus. Those are the heretics, meaning the Ebionites. So the Ebionites are somebody allegedly radioactive, and you have to avoid them. So if you stick with them, you now are the prey. You'll be called the heretic. You'll be discarded. You'll be ridiculed. Okay, God's though going to stand with the innocent and against those people who do that to these people. Let's read what Yahweh says. Yahweh saw it, and it displeased him, and there was no justice. He saw that there was no man and wondered that there was no one to intercede. Then his own arm brought him salvation, and his righteousness upheld him. He put unrighteousness as a breastplate and a helmet of salvation on his head. You know who borrows this language? Paul, of all people. But look at the context of this. And he put on garments of vengeance for clothing and wrapped himself in a zeal as a cloak. According to their deeds, so he will repay. Paul teaches it's all the opposite. You don't have to pay for anything. Your deeds don't end up judging you and causing you damnation. But God is saying to Mr. Robertson and to all the people who commit these frauds, who mislead us to think that Jesus can be a Messiah without being of the Davidic line. They want us to believe that's possible. that's a bad deed because it's false. And anyone eventually will learn that Christianity is a fraud, because eventually you can't suppress 2 Samuel. It's quoted by Paul Peter in Acts 3. We'll never know how many tens of thousands, maybe many more than tens of thousands of people have not come to Christ because it doesn't make sense, because you can't prove he's the Messiah. And how many Jews don't know? Jews all know about 2 Samuel. They're all steeped in messianic lore of how he has to be a Davidic heir. That was very clear even in the time of Christ. Do you think they lost knowledge of this? So we have led millions and millions of Jews never to accept Christ because we have been wed to the virgin birth account, and nobody tells us that we have become an impediment to them when we witness and we celebrate the birth of Christ every Christmas and we say it's a virgin birth. Do you know what we're doing? We're telling the Jews we're fools. We believe in somebody who can't be a Christian. So actually, I'm beginning to think when you celebrate Christmas and you tell people, I believe he came as a baby and Joseph wasn't his father, that's when we become co-opted to serve the enemy of God. And that's important. We're going to get here because the next line is about enemies. He says, according to their deeds, so will he repay wrath to his adversaries, repayment to his enemies. He's going to repay every single one of you, every single commentator, every single scholar for all your lies, all your deep, devilish, satanic lies that Jesus Christ was born of a virgin. Yes, that's a satanic lie. And it was some phony who changed the Gospels in the late 200s, middle 200s maybe, changed them, corrupted them to be something they weren't, and they did not know, probably. I'm not going to say they knew that they were destroying the 2 Samuel passage, but anyone who had read Acts 3 would have seen what Peter was quoting and would have known it was destructive of the gospel of Jesus Christ to contradict Peter in Acts chapter 3. Okay? Can we agree on that? Can I get an amen? You can see I'm not misleading you. That's the truth. So what is God going to do? He's going to have wrath for his adversaries, and that's all these people. Repayment to his enemies, all these people who deny the Davidic lineage of Jesus, who say he came from a virgin. False, false, false. And the alleged prophecy of Isaiah 7:14 is not about a virgin. The Jewish people will tell you that. You don't want to listen. That's not their fault. They've told you over and over again. It means a young woman, not a virgin. And in context, it was Isaiah's second son. His name was Emmanuel. Just go read it. It's in 7. I think it's verse 8 of chapter. It's in chapter 7, and you'll see his son is named Emmanuel, and we all think this is about Jesus. It's just so preposterous. We never read past what we're told to read. But I digress. To the coastlands he will render repayment, so they shall fear the name of the Lord Yahweh from the west, and his glory from the rising of the sun. For he will come like a rushing stream, which the wind of the Lord Yahweh drives. He is going to come back. He is going to come back in wrath. He's going to punish all his enemies, all the people who pretended to be Christians, who didn't have the guts to fight for Christ, who were willing to throw Jesus under the bus for a Trinity doctrine. That's all this is about. All right. So what's the article of Robertson that's ticked me off so badly, right? Studies in the New Testament. It's actually not an article, it's a book. It's a short book, though. Studies in the New Testament, in the text of the New Testament by A.T. Robertson, M.A. D.D., all the nice letters, chair of the New Testament Interpretation, Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, Louisville, Kentucky, published in 1926. And so beginning at page 99, he's going to go into, he's going to acknowledge there's the discovery of the Sinai palimpsest. We've told you about that. The Sinaitic Syriac, or the Syriac Sinaiticus, actually, is how it's usually called, by Mrs. Lewis, published in 1894. And the early manuscript reads, Jacob begat Joseph. Joseph, to whom was betrothed Mary the Virgin, begat Jesus, who was called the Christ. So this has a form of Joseph begat Jesus, which would be a groundbreaker. And later in the same article, he's going to tell you if there was only one verse that supported it, that's enough if it's proper. See, so he actually acknowledges a principle that undermines why he doesn't go along with it. And he says, well, it's just too early to tell. Too early to tell. No, when you have evidence now that goes along with what Jesus said and what the Ebionite are quoted as saying was how it read, then you have the earliest church. You now have confirmation that the earliest church's view was preserved in this book of the Sinai Sinaiticus. But it turns out there's many more sources, and he just kind of deflects them or acts like they don't clearly say what they do say. So that's a whole nother issue. Now, watch what he says here. Now, Mrs. Lewis tries to herself deflect that this was as strong a confirmation that Jesus came from a Davidic lineage, and instead she's trying to argue that the virgin birth could still be true. Now, you got to remember, she went there as a rich lady who just had time to spend, had money to burn, and she had no idea what she found. And when they got back to Cambridge, after they went to the Sinai Desert, found this manuscript, sent it back there, they didn't realize the virgin birth was at risk. So she admits this in her preface to her first work, 1894. And she says, but she was very honest enough to show you in about 5 different places it's consistently different, where it's talking about the relationship of Joseph in this situation, and he is referred to as Mary has sired him as son, has borne him a son, is mentioned twice. So it's not just once, it's actually 3 or 4 times that this reference has. But she's herself becoming under a lot of hostile attacks. So she writes a book called Light on the Four Gospels from the Sinai Palimpsest. And then he tells us, this does Mrs. Lewis, argues to save the Sinai Syneric from the charge of heresy or Ebionite influence. So see, now heresy is now being equated with Ebionite influence. So what did the early church say? We just read it in Acts 3. That's your early church, my friends, saying that Jesus had come from the flesh of David. He believes there is not a virgin birth, but a birth through Joseph. Okay, it has to be. And as I said, there is no reason to have any of the genealogy unless that is finished with it saying Joseph begat Jesus. Otherwise, you can just simply state there was a virgin birth, and it's the end of that. You don't need to go through all this stuff. The only reason for the genealogy in Matthew and the genealogy in Luke is to state that Joseph was the father. And what the corruptors did is they just took out the last line, and it doesn't make sense. And in the numerical count in in Matthew says there's 14 generations, but there's only 13. So there's clearly a line missing. Okay. So it's just really obvious that somebody deleted a line, but I digress. She notes that in Luke, okay, let me just go back here. Oh, she holds that Joseph married Mary before the birth of Jesus so that our Lord was born in wedlock. Okay. I believe so. I hope so. She notes that in Luke 2:5, the Syriac version calls Mary's Joseph his espoused wife. So what? So, I mean, she's trying to say, well, see, but there's nothing, that doesn't mean anything. Yes, they're espoused. It's what we would call a husband and a wife. They're espoused to each other. And so it's like, now let's see, he wants to cite someone else. Streeter, in his work, The Four Gospels, thinks that the reading of the Sinaitic Syriac here has, quote, small claim to be regarded as the true text. So somebody's voicing an opinion that just downplays the text, right? Does it prove it isn't true, or it has small claim that it's why is it a small claim? To me, it's a huge claim. It confirms Acts 3. It confirms 2 Samuel, right? Without which Jesus cannot be Messiah. So come on, guys. You have to, but nobody mentions it, because why? If you read 2 Samuel, do you get the impression that a young boy, when he does wrong, has to be disciplined, is the same person as the Messiah? Yet God says in that same passage that this man, this young boy, after he goes through this process of being a young boy and being corrected, when he does wrong, he will now rule the world and the whole kingdom of earth forever. Not one day, not 1 week, forever. He's exactly what we are waiting for. Your Messiah is going to come back and rule forever. And it can only be in his only Jesus. So you don't like the fact he's a boy, a regular human being. That's no reason to reject this passage and just not tell us the truth. So this is misleading us. Robertson is misleading us and is just listening to voices that just are dismissive with no real point. Again, truth doesn't matter whether somebody says it's a small claim, it's a single claim, it's one verse, it's one passage recovered. But you know what? We're also never told that all our works were systematically destroyed from the earliest church up until about the time of the Nicene Council. All these works are destroyed, and all we've found are scraps. One little passage, one Bible here, one Bible there. We found the Sinaiticus, okay, a Bible from 350. We found another Bible, the Vaticanus, which is like from 400, and so on. So, I mean, we've found one or two here or there, but that's it. The rest are scraps. What happened was systematic destruction of the texts, probably because of this particular passage in particular, because it's offensive to people. All right. Anyway, and then he goes through and he tries to be dismissive of the Curetonian Syriac. It's not that clear, and it depends how you translate it. And it uses the word virgin, all that kind of stuff. So he is dismissive. So he's not trying to find agreement. He's trying to find anything he can to dispel or say there's only try to isolate the Syriac Sinaiticus as the only thing, while the Curetonian Sinaiticus is considered equal. Okay, it just uses the word virgin, which is not in the Syriac Sinaiticus. So it's a similar thing. Joseph begat Jesus, but in the Cureton it says begat Joseph begat Jesus through the Virgin Mary. Okay, so that's basically all it says. Then he deals with a guy named Burkitt, the guy who found the Cureton, and he thinks that the Sinaitic Syriac, meaning Agnes Lewis's version, that's in Syriac instead of Greek. Burkitt finds the Cureton Sinaiticus, but that I believe is Greek. Could be wrong. Thinks that the Syriac Sinaiticus really is kin to the Greek text of the Farrar group. The Farrar group is a bunch of minuscules that are much later in time, but they also have Joseph begat Jesus. Okay, so you see now Robertson is confronted with the fact there's actually much later 13th and 14th century minuscules that agree that Joseph begat Jesus. So why do we have these late minuscules, and why do we have these very early texts that also say Joseph begat Jesus, both the Cureton and the Syriac Sinaiticus? Very interesting, right? It's a problem. How does Robertson deal with that? He just kind of sidesteps it. It seems to me he just tries to ignore it. It appears also in the Armenian version. He acknowledges the same thing in the Armenian version. We showed you that was in the prior article by, I think it was Hoben. Hoben, Hoben. And then the theory is the Farrar group represents an early uncial. So one of the earliest uncials, they're considered from the 300s, earliest, maybe even earlier. Maybe they're from the 200s. Enuncials where all the letters are in capital Greek letters. And so that would help date earlier the uncials, which are called minuscules in the other group. But Burkitt is claiming that the minuscules that have Joseph begat Jesus are connected or related to the uncials. I know this is all kind of Greek to you and me, but these scholars know what they're talking about. So the point is that Burkitt is saying you can find connections, even though they're much later in time, the 13th, 14th century, because they have some lineage all the way back into the 300s period. They potentially can be viewed in the 300s as well, because they're sisters or related to the minuscules are related to the uncials of that earlier time period. And here are the minuscules: 346, 543, 826, 828. So that may be four that say Joseph begat Jesus. Now, in the last article I mentioned to you, again, I think it was Horan, he says there's two, and I think it was 346 and 543. So these other two, 826, 828, may be two more minuscules that we need to look at. So it's actually growing in number, how much to look at. All right, let me see what else I can show you here. Now, he'll say Westcott and Hort takes no notice of variant readings at all, but modern scholars have not shared the indifference of Westcott and Hort, such as these several, Sandy, Zahn, von Soden, Moffat, Allen, Burkitt. They all show great perplexity about what was the original reading in Matthew 1:16. So you have people like Westcott and Hort just ignore it. Yeah, it's just small variants. See, they're just dismissive. And again, what is that? They're misleading people of how important it is that Joseph begat Jesus. If 2 Samuel can't come true, then Jesus isn't the Messiah, no matter how much you don't want it to be 2 Samuel, because it does, it says right there, when he does wrong, I'll discipline him. You don't want to accept that. You think that's a problem. Sorry. It doesn't matter what you think. It's what God thinks. And that's how God's going to transmit the Davidic lineage, is through that prophecy. And it has to be a Davidic heir. And no Trinity doctrine can stop that. And the Trinity doctrine is a man-made doctrine. Jesus, I'm going to say it again, Jesus in John 17, 1-3 answered the question, am I God? Is there such a thing as God the Son? Just read it yourself. John 17, 1-3. Read it today. Read it in the King James. Jesus addresses the Father. He says, Father, you're the only true God. That means there's only one God, God the Father. That means there is no such thing as God the Son. Period. Jesus says so. Let it go. Let it go. Follow Jesus. Don't listen to mankind's human doctrines. And that's what's blocking this whole thing. The fixing of this mistake of the Trinity doctrines influence has corrupted people from not accepting what Acts 3, Peter is saying. Let's keep going here. Now, this is interesting. I was shocked when I read this. If doctrinal bias be dismissed, I was wondering, is he going to get rid of this doctrinal bias against 2 Samuel? For all the readings really preserve the virgin birth. Oh. So he's saying, if we can just get rid of doctrinal bias, then all the readings really preserve the virgin birth. So he's been downplaying the uncials, the minuscules, and he's downplayed the Curaton Sinaiticus and tried to make a big deal over the fact that it says a virgin. Joseph begat Jesus through a virgin, and just now what he's making it as narrow as possible, that we really only have the Syrax Sinaiticus, and so when you count this in a very narrow way and you look at things very narrowly and you just kind of ignore stuff, you come down to what all the readings really preserve the virgin birth. Now, the word really is very, very telling. It means if it were all, he wouldn't have had to use the word really. He's just trying to say really, when you really think about it. Can you just imagine it's just one thing? And if you can just take your doctrinal bias away, what was the doctrinal bias he's telling you to put away? That Jesus has to be the Messiah from a Davidic heir. That's what so this is what I'm shocked when I was reading this. I thought he was going to go and say, hey, we need to use doctrinal reference points to figure out whether we should take seriously these variants. But he's actually saying that if you can get rid of your doctrinal bias that Jesus came from a Davidic line, you can follow and accept the fact that really all the readings say virgin birth, and that's not true. Now we have to know something. If I said this woman was a virgin and she just gave birth, I'm not saying she's had a virgin birth. I'm just simply saying she was a virgin when she gave birth, meaning other than her husband, she was never with any other man. So this is not a strange expression, yet he's acting like the word virgin in the Curaton Sinaiticus means, by definition, if it says Joseph begat Jesus through the Virgin Mary, it doesn't mean she was a virgin at the time she had. I mean, in the sense she had never been with a man when she had birth with Joseph. It would have been that she was a virgin when she married him, rather than was previously with another man, another husband who died or whatever. So that's just a really nonsensical argument that they make. So just want to point that out. And then what else? I wanted to show you something here. So based on that, he says, and then the only reason we are reading anything now that is a problem is because of accidental errors. So, this whole thing about the Sinai Sinaiticus going one way and the Curaton Sinaiticus going, similar way, and the minuscules, these four, apparently five minuscules, they go the same way. It's just all accidental errors. Just chalk it up to error. And then, but it's going to get worse. See, now it's going to expose us to new documents we didn't even know before. It's also apparently in the same thing. So he's going to claim the same error happens in something called the Arabic. I think this is diatessaron. So there was something called the diatessaron, which is sort of a kind of a way of showing multiple versions of a Bible, either in the Old Testament, New Testament, and you on different leaves. But this one was the Arabic, and it says that apparently. So it says careless scribes, for example, quote, that Orthodox persons could make slips is shown by E and also by the Arabic Diatessaron, Vatican Manuscript Chiasca A, Joseph, who from her begat Jesus the Messiah. So see, there's another document. So what did I do? I circled it. New evidence. So now we have another document. Last time we found there was 5, 6, 7 new documents mentioned in 1904 by, I think, again, it's the man Hebron. Now we have another document. So I'm going to call this number 8. Number 8 that we now got to research. And Burkitt shows that it is probable that who from her begat is a blundering translation of the Pesh, from whom was born. So now he's saying that, well, maybe this was meant to say who from her begat is a blundering translation of the Peshara, from whom was born, meaning it didn't mean it could have meant completely it was born from her, meaning with no role of Joseph's in play. Again, why is even Burkitt playing with this? Like, oh, let's find a way we can imagine that there's a blundering translation going on here that it really meant to say something else, but it came out wrong, and it sounds like Joseph begat Jesus in this Arabic diatessaron. Okay. Another instance appears in the Palestinian Syriac lectionary, which has Joseph, the husband of Mary, him from whom was born Jesus. So him would mean Joseph, was the one whom this was born from. The passive Greek form is here behind this translation, but the scribe has stupidly inserted him after Mary. So now it's a stupid mistake. But how do we know it's stupid? Because our doctrine tells us the Trinity is true. Jesus can't be 2 Samuel Davidic heir, because that son who's going to rule the whole world is, as a child, did wrong and had to be corrected. He was a human being. When we don't believe he's a human being, we believe he was God from birth, and therefore he wasn't really human. I mean, so it's also another heresy of Docetism that John tells us. The message of Antichrist will tell you Jesus did not have true human flesh. So the Jesus who fulfills 2 Samuel definitely has human flesh, because he can as a young boy, when you're not subject to being judged as a sinner, you could commit wrong. And they don't want to admit that, because they have to even imagine as a child he never did anything wrong. But I digress. So you see, they're now ascribing variants that support the Syriac Sinaiticus version of Joseph begat Jesus in the Palestinian Syriac lectionary, and that now means there's 9 documents to consider that say what we say, and they simply dismiss it, claiming what? It's an error, it's a mistake, it's stupid. Somebody did something stupid. All right. Now they got to face Timothy and Aquila. Remember, we showed you that said clearly Joseph begat Jesus. Well, how do we get around that? Listen to this. This is just disgusting to me. And you know what? We're going to take a quick break. All right. So now I've showed you in the last episode that Conybeare. Now, Conybeare is not a nobody. He is a professor of New Testament at Oxford University. This is considered, outside of being a member of the church as a bishop or something, the highest position academically you could achieve, other than the same position at Cambridge, in all of England, to be a professor of Christianity in Oxford University. Conybeare is the top dog. Okay, he is not a slouch. But get what happens to poor Conybeare here. Conybeare argued. Okay, hold on. Let's go back. The dialogue of Timothy and Aquila, which he did a exposition of the whole thing, and we provided you that last time, has the text of Greek manuscripts and adds the reading of the Sinaitic Syriac. Okay, so he says it's the same reading basically as you get in this, what Agnes Lewis found, the Sinaitic Syriac, or I call it Syriac Sinaiticus, and I think that's what it's now academically called. And it said Joseph begat Jesus, who was called Christ. That is the simplest, shortest expression you can find. And that's what we see in the earliest and oldest biblical text. And that's the Syriac Sinaiticus. Conybeare argued for this complete reading as the original. I'm not sure that makes sense in English, but he has won no support. Now, what I think, I'm trying to read Robertson's mind here because he did not express himself very well. What I think he's saying is this is a conflate reading, meaning two things in one. Okay, I don't see that here. It doesn't say Mary is the virgin. That would be a conflated reading if it was adding two things in one. This is just simply Joseph begat Jesus, who was called Christ. This is super simple. So this doesn't even make sense. But he has won no support. So I want to try to give meaning to this so we can understand what he meant by he has won no support. What I think he is saying is that ignore the word conflate and just look at reading. Has argued that this reading, and see this word as, and again I'm going to use his own argument against him. Sometimes people make mistakes, and what I think he meant to say is. Conybeare argued for this reading is the original, but he has won no support. That makes sense. And we've read his articles, and that's what he does say. So that's why I would say it's got to be what he meant to say. Now, is that true? Now, he is writing this in 1926, right? And this statement, corrected the way I've corrected it, is false. And we're gonna digress for just a moment to look at J.R. Wilkinson, academic, scholarly, theological theological articles, contradicts him in two texts. So we're going to take a quick look, and we'll be right back. All right. So what I'm about to show you is to put this even deeper. Put Mr. Robertson deeper in the tank. So he's writing in 1926, and he's saying that while Mr. Conybeare, the professor at Oxford University on New Testament, that he is claiming that that is the original reading based on his expertise, and he says no one has come to agree to him. And this is 1926, so that's 20 some odd years after the fact, and we can prove 100% that that is false. And truly, could Robertson not have known this? You shouldn't say something unless you've studied it enough that you can be confident what you said is true. Otherwise, you're misleading and a liar. So I can't say which way it is, but he's false. It's completely false. Here's what Wilkinson says. He's a renowned Christian scholar of his day. In his article, Mr. Conybeare's Textual Theories, Hibbert Journal, October 1902, page 96. Then he did another article in 1904, page 354, which basically is the same thing. We read at page 358, so we're looking at the 1904 edition, the following text. Quote, this is Wilkinson. The reading of Sirius, and it's now called Syriac, Syriac Sinaiticus, Joseph, to whom was betrothed Mary the Virgin, begat Jesus, who was called the Christ, is clearly due to a mixture of the Western text with the reading of the original genealogy. And what he means by the Western text, it has the virgin birth. It carries us back to the early days when the canonical gospel was competing with the source or sources from which it was derived. We have here perhaps a conscious corruption of the canonical text, for we find that the Syriac Sinaiticus agrees with the famous Old Latin manuscript in omitting the words, and I don't know what those words were. Continue to the next slide. The reading of Syriac Sinaiticus of 125 here is, he took his wife and she bore to him a son, and he called his name Jesus. Okay, we need to stop there for a minute. So what Agnes points out is there's multiple places where it's very clear the author believes the Joseph begat Jesus, because it's not just in Matthew 1 verse 16, it's also in Matthew 1:25 is where it says Joseph took his wife and she bore to him a son. That is clearly how you would speak to someone who actually is the true father of somebody else. And he called his name Jesus. So that's it. But let's go back here just a second here. What does he mean? We have a conscious corruption of the canonical text, for we find that in Syriac Sinaiticus agrees with the famous Old Latin manuscript. Well, we know the Old Latin manuscripts do agree Joseph begat Jesus, and that was mentioned by Horan in the prior episode, and that's also mentioned even in Robertson's text. Some of the old manuscripts agree. So what I think is happening here is canonical text means the traditional text, meaning the virgin birth. So we have here perhaps a conscious corruption of the canonical text, meaning it's deliberately different than the virgin birth account, and it specifically intends to say Joseph begat Jesus. So it's not a typo. Uh, for we find that the Syriac Sinaiticus agrees with the famous Old Latin manuscript. So that means it's agreeing with the Joseph begat Jesus of those Syriac. So that's what that means. Then he points out that this is an agreement with not just Matthew 1:16, but you go 9 verses later and you get 125, and here it says Joseph took his wife and she bore to him a son and called his name Jesus. So there's no doubt about it. This author, whoever's written this version of Matthew, that version is reflecting that Joseph was the father. Now, then he goes into this. The reading of Timothy and Aquila is, as Schmeidel says, a confluence from the Textus Receptive, i.e. the virgin birth, and the original genealogy, Joseph begat Jesus. And that's because in Timothy and Aquila, I think he's saying it mentioned the word virgin, but actually I don't think Timothy and Aquila does that. I think it's exactly the same as the Syriac Sinaiticus. So I'm not quite sure. But what's clearly going on is he's not disagreeing with Conybeare at all. Not at this point. Let's keep going. The scholar Wilkinson earlier had agreed on why we are compelled to believe both Matthew and Luke have had to have something like Joseph begat Jesus, otherwise the point of the genealogies is lost. So here's where Wilkinson points out or proves that he is on the side of Conybeare's position. So up to this point, you don't know where he stands, but here's where he's going to say the major proof that this is the true original version is it doesn't make sense to have any part of the genealogy of Jesus in either Matthew or Luke if he isn't the father of Jesus. Just omit it. Just have the virgin birth and listen to his clear logic. The text of the Syriac Sinaiticus alone seems to postulate such a clause, Joseph begat Jesus. And is it possible to believe anyone would have taken the trouble to construct a long line of natural descent if at the last step natural descent were to play no part? Ladies and gentlemen, that ends the whole point. That is the point. And you're going to see how, what's his name? Robertson deals with this. Not very well. Not very well at all. This inconsistency is best seen in the genealogy of St. Luke, where, as Holtzmann Hamkomentor zum New Testament justly remarks, it is absurd to assume an evangelist would take the trouble to construct a long genealogy of our Lord through Joseph and then, as it were, spoil all that he had done by adding that Jesus was only accounted or supposed to be the son of Joseph. The construction of such genealogies presupposes natural descent throughout. It is evident that in both St. Matthew and Luke, correction has taken place. Thank you. In the case of St. Luke, a very clumsy correction, so as to render these genealogies consistent with a virgin birth. So somebody has stupidly and foolishly added the virgin birth that makes no sense at the end of each of these. Okay? And so Wilkinson clearly refutes what Robertson claimed, that no one has come to Conybeare's position. So let's go back to that. Okay, so again, remember, we're trying to say, how is God going to judge him? Well, you shouldn't have made this statement, Mr. Robertson. F.C. Conybeare argued that this reading, the reading in dialogue of Timothy and Aquila, that adds the reading of the Sinaitic Syriac, and that is Joseph begat Jesus, who was called the Christ. That's correct. Conybeare has argued for this reading as the original, meaning that's how it originally read in our Gospels. But he has won no support. No support. Absolutely false. Wilkinson. I just quoted it to you. 1902, actually that was the 1904 article. I presume the 1902 article said the same thing. So 1904 is how many years before? It's 22 years before this statement. Is it possible he overlooked this? The Hibbert Journal is a very reputable journal, and Mr. Wilkinson is a very well-known and respected scholar of that era. Hard to believe. That's not impossible, but that means also then Mr. Robertson is making reckless claims that there's nobody who's ever come to support Mr. Conybeare. That's a very serious statement. And then it's, what are you trying to do? You're trying to undercut someone without foundation and recklessly. Just simply say, I know of no one who's come to his defense. Just to tell the truth. But to actually say emphatically, he has won no support. Wow. Wow, you've gone over the top. You are pushing and exaggerating something you don't even know, and you are taking a huge risk. You can be falsified and prove that you were unreliably exaggerating due to your bias. Let's keep going. Now, here's another thing. I asterisked it for a reason. Let's see this. As a matter of fact, we run upon snags whatever text we consider to be the original. Okay, so he's dealing with the dialogue of Timothy and Aquila. Okay, so now he's dealing with the genealogy. He's thinking that maybe, arguably, that the words Joseph begat Jesus is because of this. It may have been due to a casual desire to make the whole genealogy alike without thinking of the virgin birth controversy. So in other words, somebody is thinking, you know what? We need to make the genealogy look like a real genealogy, but let's not worry about how it ends, that it has a virgin birth. So someone's just, this is the only thing you can imagine, is because the only rational reason to write the genealogy is if Joseph is the father of Jesus. But what he's saying is maybe someone just suspended usual thought and just had a casual desire, not a serious desire. See, it's not serious. It's casual desire to make the whole genealogy alike without thinking the virgin birth controversy. Just make this, Job got Bob, Bob got, Jane, Bob, whatever it is. And you just go through the whole thing, and you ultimately end up with what? You have a virgin birth, but you were casual. You weren't being serious. You were being less than serious. You were just, it's kind of like a joke. It's casual Sunday here. See that casual desire to just give some sort of genealogy for no good reason. Now listen to this. It may, after all, be the work of an Ebionite who did not carry out his idea consistently. Do you see what he's saying? He's saying, what we might be looking at is an Ebionite came in here and said, I'm going to write out a genealogy for Joseph. And then, you know what he thinks to himself? I can't do that. I have to leave the virgin birth in there. And so I'm just going to stop one short. I mean, what the human imagination cannot fathom and make up in their brains. It's just, it's befuddling that people have this lack of ethics. Let's see what else we got here. Okay, this is just simply he's quoting people who just agree with him. We have frankly to admit that no extant reading as a whole commends itself as the original text of Matthew 1:16. Yes, we do. Professor Conybeare, professor of New Testament at Oxford, not a slouch, he says it is. It's the original. You can tell because everything else is inconsistent with the what? The genealogy. And we don't have this hypothesis. Conybeare isn't going to say, "Oh, I believe the genealogy up until it's a virgin birth is written somewhat from a casual desire, or maybe it was written by an Ebionite who basically decided not to carry out his idea of doing the genealogy to Joseph consistently." I mean, Conybeare is a serious student. These statements by Robertson are not serious scholarly statements. I hope people, even anybody who's not even trained as a scholar, knows these are not serious ways of analyzing documents. I mean, could you imagine if I did this in court? Well, Your Honor, the contract was kind of serious and casual at the same time. So the paragraphs I don't like are casual, and the paragraphs I do like are serious. I mean, that's literally what you're telling the judge. You'd be thrown out of court. The judge would laugh at me. That's what this is laughable stuff. And the idea that an Ebionite would be drafting this and then just drop it and throw in a bomb of virgin birth at the end, it would be like saying, well, Your Honor, I know the other side drafted this, let's say the other side is claiming I've corrupted the contract, but I want to explain, no, Your Honor, it was completely drafted by the other side, and they just kind of lost their mind. After they drew 9 paragraphs, they just lost their mind and wrote this paragraph that's completely in my favor over here. And the judge is going to go, but they deny they even wrote that. Well, what can I say? I'm telling you the truth, Judge. Judge isn't going to believe me. See, so this is the level of scholarship and of I have to say it's I can't believe it. It's really, truthfully, it's lying, self-delusion or lying, because this doesn't make any sense. It's being written for a casual reason, and then serious at the end when it says virgin birth, or it was written by an Ebionite who then had this idea of corrupting the text, and then he gave up at the very last second. I mean, it's just it's nonsense, ladies and gentlemen. It's nonsense. The only person who made sense is Conybeare. It was the original reading. All right. And then I asterisk this. Let's see why. It is abstractly possible that a single Greek manuscript may preserve the true text against all the rest. Okay, I thought this was interesting. He's making a concession. It's possible, theoretically, that the single line of text that we're reading in the Syriac Sinaiticus, which is the only one he concedes says Joseph begat Jesus, although it's also in the Curiton Sinaiticus, but he's tried to cast doubt on it because it used the word virgin, is he's admitting it is abstractly possible that a single Greek manuscript may preserve the true text against all the rest. Now, what he hasn't said is Syriac text. So Syriac is actually a more Hebraic text, by the way. So it's not even Greek, but I don't know why he uses the word Greek. But I think the real point he's making is even a single verse that's reputable and comes from a good source and is time-wise fits into the picture, and my view would be it matches the prophecy of 2 Samuel, which you have to have fulfilled in Jesus, who will rule the entire earth. And so what it says, when he does wrong, he'll be disciplined. That's when he's a child, when you don't get judged. It's not a sin that goes on his mark when he becomes an adult. So they just don't want you to look that way. But since Peter was looking that way, we have no reason to look away from 2 Samuel, right? Let's continue. And okay, I'm actually going to skip all that. Let me just see, because I thought there was something else very interesting here. Okay, and I don't want to make this too long here. I mean, this is a very interesting article, and you could read this on your own. Anyway, let's see here. Something ought to be said about the question of the genealogy in Matthew 1, verses 1 to 17. So now he's going to deal with the real problem. I'll take it on a little bit more. The point is whether the author of the Gospel of Matthew copied a document, a family tree, or composed a genealogy from data obtained in several details. If there was an entry in the family record of Joseph, he could, of course, be put down as the father of Jesus. Okay, now, what I think he's saying is he could be, but he doesn't necessarily have to be put down as the father of Jesus. But the answer is no. If he's doing a genealogy, he's doing it because he, Joseph, must have been put down as the father of Jesus. There's no reason to write something to give a partial genealogy. Oh, this is how all the great-grandchildren, great-grandfathers, great-grandfather number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 up the line, sired people before Joseph, and Joseph is a nobody to Jesus. No physical relationship to him. That doesn't make sense. All right. Then he says he assumed that position when he married Mary. So he assumed the position of becoming the father of Jesus by just simply marrying Mary. So it's just simply he enters a marriage with her and he becomes the father of Jesus, and that's false. It means he's the husband of Mary, but not the father of Jesus. So this is deception. This is delusional reading of things. It is hardly likely that any such record would contain the statement of the virgin birth as we have it in Matthew 1:16. So now what I think he's trying to say is the statement that Joseph begat Jesus would hardly be the way you would contain the statement that there was a virgin birth. So I just want to go back to the Syriac Sinaiticus. This is Agnes Lewis's book from 1894. I make it available for anybody who goes to our public domain list of books. And you can see what's down here. I'm going to increase the exposure here. So it's down here. Jacob begat Joseph. Joseph, to whom was betrothed Mary the Virgin, begat Jesus, who is called the Christ. So Joseph begat Jesus. Okay, so that's how it reads. Okay, so let's go look at the question again, what he's asking. But if the author had such a document, meaning a genealogy of Jesus from Joseph's heirs all the way to Jesus, it remains an open question whether he would copy it as it stood if it had, and so we're not told what the Greek words are there. But if he did that, would he add, as the Sinaitic Syriac has it, to whom the Virgin Mary was betrothed? So he's questioning, why would you add the words virgin there? And to me, again, it doesn't indicate what he seems to be suggesting, as if it says as a implying that she was a virgin giving birth without having sexual union with anybody. I think it's just like you would say, it's not a woman who had never been previously married. Let's put it that way, as an example. You just simply say she was a virgin when she had the child, not with her own husband, but with a prior person or a prior relationship. So again, I think he's asking the question because you can't affirm clearly it means something significant unless you can prove that in the mind of the writer, the word virgin meant to imply virgin birth, and therefore is a contradiction with the fact that Joseph begets Jesus in the text otherwise. So this is why you have to then say, if he's saying Joseph begat Jesus, then the word virgin is being used in a more generic sense of the person is not a virgin at the moment of conception, obviously, but at the moment that he marries her. He's married a woman who was a virgin, and later she'll become a woman who's not a virgin if you wanted to ask what she was, but he married a virgin. So he had a child through a woman who was a virgin when he married her, in other words. If he added that, he could as well have put as we have it. If he added the word virgin, he could as well have put it as we have it. It really doesn't make any sense to me what that's saying. Yeah, if he wrote it the way he did, it looked just the way we see it. So I don't get it. So here again, we reach no final conclusion. Okay, but you should. You should say, hey, praise God, Yahweh, that we have proof that Jesus has a lineage to David and fulfills the prophecy of 2 Samuel. Oh, yeah, we don't like it where it says Jesus is, when he does wrong, I'm going to discipline him. So we don't want to even go there. That's what's going on, because that's not consistent with their narrative that Jesus was God from birth. Okay, which it doesn't even say, even in John, and people think it does. It doesn't. It says the Word was God, and the Word came to dwell in flesh. When did that happen? Oh, that happened at Jesus' baptism. That's the way it used to read, because it said, "This day I've begotten thee," and the dove came down and descended on him. And then, actually, in the original version, the dove comes and enters him. And then Jesus says, the Father dwells in me. And so now it all makes sense. When Jesus is baptized, he becomes the Son of God. God comes to dwell in him. And that's what it meant in John 1:18 when it said the Word came to dwell in flesh. The word there is logos. And Jesus says, the logos is not mine, but belongs to the Father. All the words you hear and all the logos you hear from me is not from me, it's from the Father. So this all makes sense if you are educated. But see, our educators don't want us to see through this. They want us to believe. For some reason, they made the Trinity so powerful that everything is sacrificed for. Truth, Jesus' Davidic lineage has to be sacrificed. Everything has to be sacrificed on the altar of the Trinity, which, if that doesn't prove to you it's a false doctrine, I don't know what to tell you, because it's corrupted. It's corrupted the way people think, the way people analyze things, and that's exactly what Robertson's doing. He's doing it. We can't reach a final conclusion. Yes, you can. You have a eureka moment. You have a text that says Jesus begot Joseph, and you have more than that. You got the Latin italic versions that say the same thing. Several minuscules that say the same thing. You have the Curian Syriac that says it similarly but slightly differently, and then you have the Timothy and Aquila say Joseph begat Jesus exactly in the same form as the Syriac Sinaiticus, but even a little simpler. Doesn't even use the word virgin. All right. Let's see. Is there anything else I want to show? Okay, and then I finally have to show you what led me to conclude that God's not going to handle this very well with the way Mr. Robertson was hoping. The only certain result is that, as has already been stated several times, all the readings known to us bear witness to the virgin birth of Jesus, both in Matthew 1:16 and 1:18 to 25. Completely, utterly false. By I don't know how many times that can be false. Not only is the Syriac Sinaiticus clearly contradictory, also the Curaton Sinaiticus, unless you distort it the way he tried to do it, unless you ignore all the Italian documents, or unless you avoid and ignore all the not the uncials, the minuscules that say the same thing. I mean, what is he talking about? All the readings known to us? Wow. Wow. What is God going to do to him? Particularly if some Jewish person is researching and trying to find out the truth, and this is what they read, and this is what they read. Some dumb Gentile doesn't know the difference of why it matters. We are dumb Gentiles, and I'm going to say it 100 times because it's the only reason this fraud has persisted as long as it has, because we don't know the Bible. We don't know that something like 2 Samuel has to be considered. We don't know that in Acts chapter 3 that Peter is quoting 2 Samuel. If we read it, we think there's something wrong. How can this be Jesus? Because it says if he does wrong, he will be punished, right? So we are just totally misled to not look in the right directions and not to care and to just accept what the tradition we've been given, even though it makes no sense and does deprive Jesus of being have the right to be Messiah at all. Okay, we just don't know enough that we are being led and fed a pack of lies. And then you've got somebody like this who not only tries to deflect legitimate verses and fails to do so. He then claims he's won. Boom. The only certain result, Mike, there's no uncertainty at all, is that, as has already been stated several times. So just because he said it, I don't remember him saying this ever once. This is the only time he says this. All the readings known to us bear witness to the virgin birth of Jesus, both in Matthew 1:16 and 1:18 to 25. He never said that before. I would have been shocked had he said it, because of what he was saying is contradictory of that. He was admitting that there was contrary passages in, and he was trying to explain them away. But just positing possibilities doesn't mean you've explained it away. But even if you thought that was possible, you can't use the word certain. The only certain result is there's only one reading. I mean, it's literally the most preposterous statement in his whole thing, and it's the conclusion of his work. The concluding sentence is a big fat lie. That's when I said to myself, I have to write this. I was not planning on writing this the way I did. So now I want to go back to show you again, when you read the judgments of God, how he's going to deal with him. Read this with me one more time and just ask yourself how God is going to treat somebody who would lie to you like this, lie to Jewish people who are reading this, lie to the Christians who keep us in the dark. What do you think God's going to do to this guy? Even with all his books and all his wonderful works where he did translations and he did all his editing, this is where he's going to get tripped up, because this involved his son. This involved his son and his plans with his son and how people have to perceive who Jesus is. And you are lying to people and saying that he was not begotten by Joseph. Therefore, he cannot be Messiah. I don't think God's going to take that very lightly, because you've undercut the credibility of God's word. You've denied God's word, but you've also taken away the ability of his son to be the Messiah to anyone of intelligence, anybody who's biblically literate. You have to rely upon biblically illiterate Gentiles to not know what you're saying is how horrible and what the damage you've done to Christianity, you and a lot of others like you, but you in particular, Mr. Robertson, because I've read a lot on the virgin birth account, but nobody has lied as bad as you just did right here in this last sentence. So let's take a look at Isaiah one more time. Isaiah 59, verses 15 to 19. Truth is lacking, and he who departs from evil makes himself a prey. So anybody who tries to point this out is going to be themselves attacked. The Lord Yahweh saw it, and it displeased him, and there was no justice. He saw that there was no man, and wondered that there was no one to intercede. Then his own arm brought him salvation, and his righteousness upheld him. He put on righteousness as a breastplate, and a helmet of salvation on his head. He put on garments of vengeance for clothing, and wrapped himself in zeal as a cloak. According to their deeds, so will he repay, Mr. Robertson. wrath to his adversaries, repayment to his enemies, all enemies of Christ, who lie and say he wasn't the Messiah, who say he was, and knowingly so, meaning they knowing all the facts. And you have all the facts, Mr. Robertson. You are even looking at the verses that prove he is the Messiah, that he was born of Joseph, of the lineage of David. None of the Jews know about this verse. And if they did, that you've already deflected them away from even considering by your false conclusion, your false lying conclusion, Mr. Robertson. I've lost all respect for you. All the good you've done, all the good commentary. It's worthless if you were willing to lie about Christ's Davidic lineage and say it doesn't matter. It's false. All we know for certain is it always says virgin birth. That's what you are lying to people about for fact. Let's keep reading. Wrath to his adversaries, repayment to his enemies, including Mr. Robertson. To the coastlands he will render repayment, so they shall fear the name of the Lord Yahweh from the west, and his glory from the rising of the sun. For he will come like a rushing stream, which the wind of the Lord Yahweh drives. At least that's my opinion. I could be wrong. Okay. But I'm saying this all to warn all of us. We can freely believe in the virgin birth if we want to, as long as we don't tell anyone about it. But on the other hand, if you were dealing with someone who doesn't know Christ and you want to lead them to Christ, you should know the prophecy of 2 Samuel, that there is this person who will fulfill this prophecy. And yes, he's a human being, and don't shy away from it. Yes, when he's a young child, if he does something wrong, God is going to discipline him. But you know what? Don't worry about that. The more important thing is the promise that this is a figure who will be the ruler of the world, and yet he is of the line and the lineage of David, and he will rule the world forever, and he will rule in justice. So that's why we need to go back, and let me read you the passage in that again, just so you can read it. The Lord declares to you, 2 Samuel 7, verses 8 to 16, that Yahweh declares to you that the Yahweh himself will establish a house for you when your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, David, he's saying. I will raise up for you offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with flogging inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. All right, everybody. I hope that helps you understand that there's a lot at stake here when misinformation gets polluted into our mainstream, and Christians then look at anybody who's disputing the virgin birth as somehow the ones who are wrong, instead of the people who've denied the Davidic lineage of Jesus Christ, which is necessary under 2 Samuel for him to be this heir who will sit on a throne that will be established forever. All right. God bless everybody. Take care. Ciao. Bye.